December 4, 1944, Camp Trinidad, Colorado. Snow fell softly over the red brick barracks, coating the guard towers, the mess hall roofs, and the razor wire that didn't seem quite sharp enough. From the train station outside the compound, 37 newly arrived prisoners stepped off the rail cars in silence, their breath fogging in the high desert air. Lieutenant Takao Fujimori blinked against the brightness. It was his first time seeing snow. It drifted quietly across his worn uniform, settled on his shoulders like ash. He glanced at the guard watching them from the platform. The man was smoking a cigarette, not even holding his rifle. Fujimori noticed something else. The gate. It was open. Not unlocked. Open. And for a brief second, he wondered if this was a trick. Back home, escape was not a concept. American POWs in Japanese camps were chained to bamboo poles. Here, the only chains were the wind and the strange silence. The others had noticed it too. A few men exchanged uneasy glances. Corporal Nishida whispered, "Where are the dogs?" There were none. No barking, no searchlights, no shouts, just snow and open sky. And a gate that didn't shut. The prisoners stepped inside. 2 hours later, Fujimori stood at attention in a warm barracks as a man with a clipboard handed out bedsheets. The man wore no uniform, just a wool cardigan. He smiled when he spoke. "Laundry gets picked up Thursdays. Dinner's in 30 minutes. You'll hear the bell." Another guard entered with a tin of fresh coffee and placed it on a stove in the center of the room. Fujimori didn't speak. He hadn't spoken since stepping off the train. He didn't trust this place. It was too quiet. Too warm. Too clean. Across the room, Private Yasuda was testing the mattress on his bunk, bouncing slightly. "It's soft," he muttered. "Softer than home." "Be careful," Fujimori snapped. "It's a trick, American brainwashing." Yasuda nodded, but didn't stop running his fingers along the wool blanket. The bell rang. Dinner. They expected punishment. They got meatloaf. A steaming tray piled with it, next to mashed potatoes and green beans. Another tray held white bread, real bread, not rice crackers. At the end of the line was a pitcher of milk and warm apple pie in steel pans. None of them moved. The American cook, a middle-aged man with a spotted apron, laughed. "It's not poison, eat up." Still, Fujimori waited until the others tried it first. Then, cautiously, he took a bite. He hadn't tasted beef in over a year. The mess hall was silent for several minutes, save for the sound of forks on metal. By the second week, the guards no longer accompanied them between barracks and the yard. The prisoners walked in groups, wearing their coats, chatting in low tones. They began writing letters, at first with reluctance, then with enthusiasm. Fujimori watched men carefully construct sentences in Japanese, asking the Red Cross to send word to mothers and wives. Some asked for photographs. One even requested a book of haiku. In the corner of the barracks, a private from Osaka started carving wooden chess pieces with a pocket knife. One morning, a man burst into the barracks holding a newspaper. "They let me read it," he said breathlessly. "The Americans, they let me read their newspaper." Fujimori remained distant. He paced the yard each morning, counting guard rotations, measuring fence lines, tracking weather. He fought on Saipan. He knew what Americans could do when they wanted something. He began to make a plan, escape. Maybe with Nishida and Yasuda, it would be easier than he expected. The guards barely watched them. The fences weren't electrified. The towers didn't even have spotlights. But when he brought up the idea to Nishida one night, the reply stunned him. "Escape," Nishida blinked. "Why?" "To return to the empire," Fujimori said. "Return?" Nishida glanced around the barracks. "You mean go back to that island where we watched our own men jump off cliffs rather than surrender, where we were starving and cursing the emperor in our sleep?" Fujimori's jaw tensed. "It is our duty." Nishida didn't answer. He just reached under his bunk and pulled out a harmonica, began to play softly. It was a Japanese folk tune. Fujimori sat in silence, listening. Christmas came, and with it, snowfall so thick the prisoners couldn't see more than 5 feet beyond their windows. The mess hall was decorated with strings of tinsel and paper snowflakes. One guard entered with a Victrola and played Bing Crosby records, while the prisoners ate turkey and cranberry sauce. Later, they were told the lights in the yard would stay on all night, not for surveillance, but for celebration. It didn't feel like captivity anymore. It felt like something else. One night, Fujimori couldn't sleep. He left the barracks, walked past the recreation building, and stood near the fence. A lone guard sat in a booth reading a paperback novel. He didn't look up. Fujimori walked slowly along the perimeter. No dogs, no patrols. Then he heard something, laughter from inside. He turned. Through the window of the recreation hall, a dozen prisoners were sitting around a table playing cards with 2 American guards. One of them, the same one who had once patrolled the yard with a rifle, now had his feet on the table and was teaching a prisoner how to shuffle. Fujimori turned back to the fence, looked out toward the darkness beyond. The world outside was silent, frozen. The camp behind him was warm. He didn't step through, he went back inside. They had once trained for this possibility: capture. They were told, escape at all costs, die before dishonor. But in the spring, when the weather warmed and the Red Cross delivered new boots, one man joked that they were better than the ones they'd worn in Burma. No one disagreed. Another wrote a haiku in chalk on the barracks wall. Snow falls outside wire. Warm bread softens old hatred. Empire fades like frost. At the end of the first month, the camp commandant asked if any of the new arrivals wanted to speak to an escape officer, a man from the U.S. Army trained to interrogate for signs of planning. No one volunteered. Not because they were afraid, but because, for the first time since Saipan, they were full. Full of food. Full of silence. Full of questions. None of them had answers, but for the first time they weren't sure they needed any. 3 weeks after arriving at Camp Trinidad, the snow had melted. The high desert sun returned with sharp clarity, revealing the dry ridgelines in the distance, the barbed wire shining faintly like something ornamental instead of functional. Lieutenant Takao Fujimori stood at the edge of the baseball field, his arms crossed as the American guards played a slow, clumsy game of catch with 3 prisoners. The guards weren't armed. No one was shouting. The pitcher was a 19-year-old from Alabama with a crooked smile and a lopsided cap. The batter, Private Yasuda, had never held a bat before arriving in America. His stance was awkward, elbows too high, but when the ball came, he swung anyway. Crack! The sound echoed across the yard, clean and crisp. The ball flew over the outfield and rolled against the fence. The POWs on the sidelines cheered. Someone clapped. Fujimori said nothing, he simply watched. That night in the barracks, the game was still being talked about. Yasuda grinned as he sat on his bunk. "They're teaching me how to pitch next." "Why?" Fujimori asked. "So you can entertain them." "No," Yasuda said simply, "because I asked." The word stuck. Spring turned the yard green. Wild grasses pushed through the fences. The guards stopped counting heads with clipboards. They didn't need to. No one had tried to escape. No one even talked about it anymore. What they talked about now were the letters. Each week, stacks of envelopes arrived. Red Cross intermediaries had traced families in Yokohama, Kyoto, Sapporo, wives, sisters, fathers. Replies came back in thin airmail sheets, neatly folded, sometimes with photographs. One man, Corporal Nakahara, received a drawing from his daughter, a crayon picture of Mount Fuji with 2 figures standing beneath it. When he showed it to the others, no one spoke. They didn't need to. They passed the paper around like something sacred. The guards changed too. They no longer shouted commands. They made jokes. Some shared cigarettes. One, a middle-aged sergeant named Lowell, brought books from the town library and left them on a shelf in the mess hall. Fujimori found one written in Japanese. He opened it skeptically and saw that someone had handwritten a note in the margin. "Thought you might like this. L." He looked around the empty room. No one was watching. He read 5 chapters before he even realized it. In April, the camp commander introduced a new program. Work details. Voluntary, paid, off-site. The idea was simple. Those who wanted could earn small wages helping with nearby agriculture or construction. It was a test. Everyone knew it. But dozens volunteered. They rode trucks to beat farms, walked freely through rows of crops, talked with American foremen who didn't even wear sidearms. One group helped build a grain silo in town. None tried to run. Fujimori had expected someone would. He watched closely, listened for whispers. But the whispers were about work hours and tools, and which lunch shack had the best stew. That night back in the barracks, Yasuda placed a coin on his pillow. "What's that for?" Fujimori asked. "Got paid today," Yasuda smiled. 10 cents. "For what?" "Carrying sacks of potatoes." "And what will you do with it?" Fujimori asked, incredulous. Yasuda considered. "Send it home or buy a pen, haven't decided." Fujimori looked away. At night, the barracks were no longer quiet. There was music, always softly played, from an American phonograph they were allowed to use. Jazz, slow, swinging alien. Some men hated it, others loved it. A few hummed along. One began whittling a clarinet from scrap wood. And sometimes, late into the evening, voices carried down the corridors. Quiet laughter, recited poetry, snoring. It didn't sound like prison. By early May, Fujimori found himself waking at the same hour each day without needing the bell. He folded his blanket, swept the floor, helped another man adjust his crutch. There was no order to it, just rhythm. One morning, while polishing his boots outside, he noticed the barbed wire fence was gone from one section of the compound. He looked to the guard booth, no one inside. He walked forward carefully. No one stopped him. A maintenance crew, Americans and prisoners both, had removed the wire the day before to replace a section of fencing. No one had bothered to reinstall it yet. There was nothing between him and open Colorado desert. He stepped to the edge, looked out. The ridgelines shimmered in the sun. Far in the distance, a freight train curved across the land like a slow black needle. He could have walked. He didn't. He turned around and walked back to the barracks. Somewhere that month, the word enemy stopped appearing in daily conversation. The men didn't refer to Americans as the Tekikoku anymore, not because they loved them, but because it no longer felt accurate. The hatred required distance. This place erased it. And no one could quite explain when the fear had turned into familiarity. A week later, a visitor arrived, an official from the Japanese embassy in Switzerland, traveling under neutral status. He was to inspect the camp, document its treatment, and report back. The prisoners gathered in the yard for a formal address. The visitor stood in a polished overcoat, scribbling into a notebook. "Do any of you wish to report abuse?" he asked through an interpreter. "Mistreatment, starvation, coercion?" No one raised a hand. He looked puzzled. "Do you know you are not required to work here?" Several nodded. "Do you know you may request transfer or repatriation?" Still no one spoke. Finally he asked, "Then what would you say this place is?" Fujimori raised his hand, slowly. He stepped forward, straightened his back. Then answered, "It is the only place in 3 years I have not dreamed of dying." The visitor made a note, closed his notebook. He didn't say another word. At sunset that day, the lights came on across the compound. Warm yellow glows in the barracks windows, orange over the mess hall. And then music from the phonograph, a woman's voice this time, slow, trembling. No one translated the lyrics. They didn't need to. The prisoners sat quietly, listening. Some with their eyes closed. Some with their letters in hand. The gate still had no lock. No one asked for one. By the end of June, there were more pigeons inside the wire than guards. They roosted under the rafters, strutted across the dirt yard during roll call, and cooed loudly in the early hours as though announcing a kind of peace that no official had yet signed. Private Yasuda had begun feeding one from his canteen cup. The bird would land on the rail of the window just after sunrise, tilt its head, and wait. "Why do you feed it?" Fujimori asked one morning, half curious, half annoyed. "It doesn't belong here," Yasuda replied, "same as us." "But it stays," Fujimori muttered. Yasuda didn't answer. The bird hopped closer. By midsummer, the library in the recreation building had expanded. Prisoners had begun organizing shelves by language and topic. One barracks held a drawing class. Another held English lessons, mostly informal, taught by guards with thick Midwestern accents. One guard, a corporal with a limp from North Africa, taught the prisoners the phrase, "nothing to it." When someone completed a chore, made a good throw in baseball, or translated a sentence correctly, he'd slap his thigh and say it. "Nothing to it." Soon the phrase passed through the camp like slang. It became a joke, a greeting, a philosophy. Even Fujimori caught himself saying it once, to himself, after mending a broken latch on the barracks door. He looked around afterward, as if to see who had heard him. No one had. Letters from home arrived less frequently. Japan's infrastructure was collapsing under the weight of Allied bombing, but when letters did arrive, they were smaller, thinner, sometimes just one sentence. "We are alive. Your brother did not return from Saipan. Food is gone, but neighbors share when they can." The contrast hit like a punch. In camp, they were eating meat twice a week. Outside, their families were starving. Corporal Nakahara stopped opening his letters aloud after July. No one asked why. In August, the camp received a gramophone recording from a Japanese-American interpreter named Sergeant Fuji. He had compiled messages from families, translated and recorded them onto vinyl with a scratchy jazz track behind his voice. One of the prisoners played it on the rec hall phonograph. The voices were thin and trembling. Some mispronounced their own sons' names. Others paused too long between words, as if unsure what was safe to say. But when one voice said, "We heard you are being treated well. We are grateful," a ripple passed through the room. No one looked at each other. Fujimori stared at the wooden floor until the record clicked into silence. By the start of September, 2 men had asked to stay past the war's end. One had skills in carpentry, another in medical administration. The guards didn't know what to say. They promised to pass the requests up the chain. Fujimori was stunned. "You want to remain in the enemy's country?" The medic shrugged. "There are no ashes here, no empty rice bowls, no bomb craters." "You're still a prisoner," Fujimori reminded him. The man shook his head. "If this is prison, I don't know what to call what we came from." In early October, a new group of prisoners arrived, men from the Philippines campaign. They were thin, ragged, eyes sunken. Their first week was filled with silence and disbelief. They asked if the Americans had drugged the water. One man refused to eat for 4 days, convinced it was poisoned. Fujimori watched them carefully. He remembered that feeling. He waited. On the 5th day, the man who had refused food was seen crying quietly in the yard after his first hot shower. He never mentioned poison again. With fall came the harvest. The men who had signed up for work details came back with crates of apples, sacks of potatoes, and tales of American families who handed them cold lemonade and offered them gloves. One farmer gave a POW a harmonica. Another offered a book of Mark Twain stories, dog-eared and filled with notes in the margins. They brought the stories back into the barracks like contraband. But there was nothing forbidden in them, just kindness. The worst crime the Americans committed was indifference, and even that, at times, felt like mercy. By November, the camp felt less like a camp. The baseball diamond had chalk lines again. A prisoner organized a haiku contest. Another began translating excerpts of the Grapes of Wrath into Japanese on loose-leaf paper. One man, who had refused to speak English when he arrived, now wrote his diary in it. Fujimori had not planned for this. None of them had. At roll call one morning, a guard announced that 2 prisoners had been found walking outside the outer perimeter. A chill ran through the yard. Escape. But the next sentence changed everything. They were returning. The 2 men had wandered too far during a work detail on a local farm. They had been offered a ride into town. They declined. When the sun set, they turned around and walked 8 miles back through scrubland. When asked why, one replied, "Where else would we go?" That night someone drew a map on the back of a letter, a route out, through the wire, across the ridgeline, past a ranger station. Fujimori found it tucked under his blanket, a test or a joke. He read it 3 times, memorized it, then tore it up. Not because he feared failure, but because he didn't want to go. Near the end of November, rumors of Japan's surrender filtered through Red Cross briefings. The war was over, or close enough to it. When the commandant confirmed it, no one cheered. Some stared at the floor. Some wept. One man stood up, walked outside, and screamed into the wind. Fujimori sat on the barracks step and watched the sunset. Yasuda sat beside him, eating an apple. "We'll be sent home soon," he said quietly. Fujimori nodded. "What do we tell them?" Yasuda didn't answer. The pigeon landed nearby, waited. He fed it a piece of apple. The news came on a Tuesday. 2 guards entered the rec hall while the men were stacking books. Their uniforms were pressed, boots polished. One held a folded note. The other adjusted the radio's dial. At 9:05 a.m., the voice of President Truman crackled through the static. 16 hours ago, an American airplane dropped 1 bomb on Hiroshima. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. No one spoke. Some of the prisoners didn't understand the words, but they heard the tone. Others waited for translation, which came slowly, haltingly, from a Japanese-American interpreter who'd never had to explain the end of a world before. Hiroshima was gone. Not invaded, not surrounded, gone. Fujimori leaned back against the wall. He tried to picture the city. He had passed through it in 1940 on the way to training school. He remembered the bridges, the rivers, the trolley cars. He tried to picture it on fire and couldn't. He tried to picture it as ash and couldn't. It felt like someone had erased the memory from his head before erasing it from the earth. That night no one played records. No one asked for chess. No one fed the pigeon. The yard was still, the barracks were silent. But somewhere around 1 a.m., Fujimori heard Yasuda whisper something. It was so soft he almost missed it. "She lived there," Yasuda said. "Who?" "My sister." Fujimori didn't reply. He just turned over in his bunk and stared at the wood paneling, as if he could burn a hole through it by looking long enough. Days passed, then Nagasaki, then silence from Tokyo, then the voice of the emperor himself trembling through the radio, surrendering in language so poetic it hurt. Endure the unendurable. The war was over. No cheers in Camp Trinidad. No flags, no fireworks. Just a group of men who had already lost a war inside themselves before it was ever declared over. The guards tried to be gentle. They handed out translated announcements. They held back their own celebrations. They nodded more, spoke less. One of them, Corporal Lowell, brought a cake to the mess hall. It said peace in white frosting. No one touched it. Later that night, it was still sitting on the table, untouched, slowly drying under the heat lamp. Fujimori found himself avoiding the piano room. He had taken to sitting in the laundry room instead, where the steam rose from basins and the smell of soap lingered. It was quiet there. The only sound was water running through pipes. He sat with a crossword puzzle, an English one. He understood half the clues, guessed the rest. Across from him, Yasuda mended a tear in his sleeve. "We'll be transferred soon," Yasuda said softly. "Repatriated." "To what?" Fujimori looked at him. "You sound like you don't want to leave." Yasuda didn't answer right away. He folded his sleeve carefully, as if that tiny line of stitching might be the only thing holding him together. "Don't you wonder," he finally said, "how they'll look at us?" "They'll honor us," Fujimori replied. "We survived." Yasuda shook his head. "No, we surrendered." A week later, they received new uniforms. Clean, plain, blue-gray. No numbers, just initials stitched into the collar. They looked like civilians. They felt like ghosts. In the final days before departure, the camp transformed again. The fences were taken down entirely. Not for security, for symbolism. The guards told them they were free to walk the perimeter, even beyond. A few wandered to the edge of the desert, stood there in the dry grass, squinting toward nothing. No one ran. No one even walked far. Fujimori saw a guard reading on a bench near the old gate, now open forever. He approached, hesitated. "Sergeant," he said. The guard looked up. "Why didn't you ever lock it?" The guard blinked, then shrugged. "Didn't need to." Fujimori waited for more. Some joke, some jab. But the guard just returned to his book. That was the answer. The trucks arrived the next morning. The POWs lined up with bags over their shoulders, letters folded in pockets, some holding Red Cross parcels. One man carried a harmonica in his boot. Another had a photo of the librarian's daughter. She had given it to him as a thank you for translating Hemingway. No one spoke as they boarded. The guards shook hands, a few saluted. Corporal Lowell pulled Yasuda aside quietly, slipped a note into his hand. "Just a recipe," he said. "Meatloaf, you said you liked it." Yasuda nodded, but didn't trust his voice. The trucks pulled away slowly. Fujimori didn't look back, but he didn't look forward either. The ship that took them home was slow, gray, bare. The Japanese coast appeared like a smudge on the horizon. Cities cratered, ports ruined, children in rags holding out rice bowls to men in uniform who had come back from what they'd been told was victory. One of the POWs was beaten at the dock, not by officials, but by a crowd of civilians who mistook him for a collaborator. He never spoke again. Fujimori and Yasuda were separated in processing. They never saw each other after that. Months later, Fujimori stood in his childhood home, now missing a roof and 2 walls. His mother had died during the bombing of Nagoya. His brother was missing in the Philippines. He found a piece of charred wood, picked it up. It was from the frame of his old bed. He didn't cry. He just stood there, holding the past like it was a piece of driftwood. In a small drawer, he found a Red Cross envelope. Inside was the recipe Lowell had given Yasuda. He read it twice, then folded it and placed it in his jacket. No one ever asked him about the camp. When they asked where he had been, he said only, "In America." He never said the word prison. Winter returned to Nagoya in late January 1946. Fujimori walked past the rubble that had once been the post office. Half a wall still stood, a corner of faded red brick poking out from the ash and twisted steel. Beside it, someone had spray-painted characters in thick, slanted strokes. "We remember who ran." He kept walking. His coat was American, wool-lined, gifted to him by a camp quartermaster who'd said, "Don't freeze before you get to the boat." He still wore it, not for sentiment, for warmth. He no longer apologized for it. He took work moving rubble for Rice, eventually at a paper company. He didn't speak much, didn't drink, didn't bow as deeply to the older men at the train station. They said he had come back strange, that America had made him soft. Once someone asked if he had tried to escape. He told them no. They laughed not because it was funny, but because it wasn't believable. "Not once." "No." "Why not?" Fujimori had looked at the man for a long time, then said, "Because I wasn't in prison." Yasuda sent him a letter in March. It had taken 4 months to reach him. Inside was a photograph of a baseball game, not prisoners, not guards, just men in uniforms under Colorado sky laughing. On the back, one sentence, "I dream about the fences sometimes." No return address. Fujimori burned the envelope. He folded the photo and kept it in a box with a red cross spoon and a chess pawn. He married in 1950. His wife never asked much about the war. Once she found the spoon and asked where it came from. "America," he said. "From battle." He paused. "From a table." She didn't ask again. In the years that followed, he found other returnees. Some worked as clerks, others taught. One ran a noodle stand. They never greeted each other as soldiers. They never spoke of the uniforms or the camps or the guards. But they nodded, a small nod, nothing more. They understood. In 1962, a journalist interviewed former POWs for a documentary that never aired. Fujimori declined, but he read the transcripts when they were published years later. One man, a farmer from Hokkaido, had said something that stayed with him. "I thought I would carry shame. I carried silence instead." Fujimori underlined the sentence. He folded the page and placed it next to Yasuda's photo. The pigeon never came back, but sometimes when the wind caught just right, Fujimori imagined he could hear it, cooing on a windowsill, waiting. He would turn toward the sound, pause, then return to whatever he was doing. He never said goodbye to America. But every night, before he turned out the light, he folded his clothes neatly at the foot of the bed. Just like he had learned to, in a place that never needed locks. The year he turned 70, Takao Fujimori stopped folding his clothes at the foot of the bed. He still kept the habit of waking at dawn, brushing lint off his jacket, making his tea with quiet precision. But the folding, he let that go. He didn't know why. Maybe it was his hands, or maybe the memories had dulled at the edges, softened from steel into cotton. His grandson once asked him what war was like. Fujimori didn't answer right away. He stared into his cup. Then said only, "Long." A small reunion was held in Osaka in the spring of 1985. Someone had tracked down former prisoners. The list had names Fujimori hadn't heard in decades. Nakahara, Suzuki, even a rumor about Yasuda alive, living somewhere near Kobe, a retired teacher with 3 grown sons. He went. The room was quiet at first. Men who'd once shared bunks now greeted each other like diplomats, slow bows, careful phrases. Then someone made a joke about the pigeon. The laughter shattered the room's formality. Cups were raised, photographs shared. The silence of 4 decades cracked open. They spoke of mess hall trays, of Bing Crosby records, of the time someone pretended to escape just to see if the guards would care. They had, but not enough to shoot. Fujimori asked about Yasuda. A man pointed to the far side of the room, where an older man stood near the window, watching traffic. He approached slowly. Yasuda turned, smiled like it hadn't been 40 years. "I wondered if you'd come," he said. "I didn't plan to." "You never did." They talked for hours, not of death or bombings or orders, of pie, of music, of how strange it had been to be treated like something fragile when the war had taught them to be hard. "You remember the gate?" Fujimori asked. Yasuda nodded, "Always open." "And we never left." "We did," Yasuda said softly, "just not the way we thought." Years later, Fujimori stood on a tarmac in Colorado. He had returned as a civilian, an invitation from a historical society, a short speech, a tour. The buildings were gone, replaced with warehouse foundations. Only a plaque remained near the fence line. It read, "Here stood Camp Trinidad. From 1943 to 1946, over 3,500 Japanese prisoners of war were held here. No successful escapes were recorded. All returned home." He stared at the last line for a long time. The phrase meant something different now. Returned home. But what was home? He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. Inside was the recipe Lowell had written by hand, faded, brittle. He placed it at the base of the plaque, then stepped back. He visited the town afterward, sat at a diner, ate pie that didn't taste like memory, watched a waitress pour coffee with a kindness she didn't know she was practicing. When the check came, he paid in cash, left a tip. And a note, "I stayed here once, thank you." He flew home the next day, slept for 10 hours, dreamed of fences that never closed. And a pigeon waiting patiently on the windowsill.